So continuing on in the second great part of my book, we're gonna talk about uh, we're talking about unions and conservatism and what makes a conservative a conservative. These unions encourage laziness and promote inefficiency in the workplace by negotiating contracts that allow for lower production rates and raise prices for the consumer. This culminates in the lowering of living standards for citizens while enriching a few individuals at their expense. It is a crime against the millions of workers who do not participate in the unions. Conservatives might admit that the purpose of unions is decent and they do have a positive effect on the fight against socialism, but the positive values stemming from collective bargaining quickly vanish when the activity of the union lacks an emphasis on protecting workers' individual freedoms. Another problem lies with unions trying to interfere with industries as a whole rather than individual employers. We should be promoting the rise to management rather than fostering empathy and apathy for low-level labor. And this has all been mostly to the benefit of union leaders rather than those low-level employees. All of which takes away from the freedom afforded to wage labor employees. Okay, so the only way unions can perform at their desired level is to have voluntary membership, have the union confined to simple collective bargaining, and have that bargaining be limited between the workers and the businesses employing them. One of the most fundamental rights in the United States is the natural right of association and gathering. However, forced union membership degrades this freedom and does the opposite, stretching the freedom to associate to the extent that was prominent in decades past and may very well return has cost individuals liberty in the guise of social righteousness. The fix is to create laws that protect freedom of association and statewide right to work laws which prevent mandatory unionization. Freedom of association is a natural right, and right to work laws stem from that natural right. There is, of course, the argument that those who don't join the unions are still benefiting from the work that unions are doing. However, seeking a remedy by forced compulsion to join the unions is not the answer. There is a big difference between joining a union because one should and having to join the union because they are forced to. And support for a union should be earned in the union, and if the union is worthy of support, the people will join. If unions can force employees to join, then there is no incentive for those who do not want to join to act responsibly. If employees are able to choose whether to join a union or not, depending on the performance of the union, then joining and ending corruption would be more attractive. This is because if unions were required to garner support rather than mandate it, they would be incentivized to hold themselves to a higher standard. On the topic of political freedom, one instance where the people exercise such is in their right to vote for politicians of their own choosing. Another instance is through political donations of financial means. This is all relevant to dispersing political power amongst multiple candidates and a show of flexibility of the democracy the people inhabit. Freedom to support politicians is the utmost emphasis of the United States democratic process. Unions and those who support the large bureaucratization of the American political process compromise this right to support candidates of the people's choosing. Without the basics of individuals' right to support whom they choose, interest groups and the small number of people who control them are left to make the major political candidate selections. In this case, political activity is not allowed to flow freely, and the select few control the flow of finances. These interest groups, or unions, also provide the manpower for campaigning and for running candidacies. These groups perform such duties and are even sometimes paid to do so. The sponsorship by interest groups and unions distributes large quantities of information, and the decision making is funneled vertically to a few or a single individual. Even further, individuals who put money toward interest groups or unions are not able to pick and choose how money is spent, but rather delegate this to those in charge who have their own interests at heart. The interest groups, in the guise of supporting particular issues, actually choose candidates based on whether they will support the interests of the group in terms of a yes or no vote on legislation, and not on merit or accountability or of the actual politician. Sometimes economic and social reasons are the premise for supporting interest groups or unionization, especially when aligned with political parties or having overabundant means for picking and choosing candidates, even when the community does not necessarily feel supportive of such a group, or if that group has outdated purposes. To achieve greater separation and distribution of power, it should be the duty of individuals and not those who control politicized organizations of mundane meetings and minutes. In the case of unions, their purposes should be constrained to those of economic and business purposes. There is no reason for corporations or unions to be involved in the political process as they are today anyway. On economic freedom, excuse me, on economic freedom, Americans have been discouraged by the powers of corporate leaders and various committees behind closed doors. One way to put the political power of these businesses and committees and interest groups into their proper place is to have the government create protections for individuals, keeping in mind their individual freedoms and natural rights. This means that through the protection provided by the states and local governments, the federalization of management can be kept at bay. All of this is in a fight against the socialization of the United States, which would see businesses, political committees, and interest groups working together. Sorry, I've been talking a lot. Which would see businesses, political committees, and interest groups working together with the illusion that they are helping the people but enriching themselves by providing political power to those who are in charge, not given to the people where it belongs. Okay, I got some water, so hopefully that helps. Then, after all of these groups are in accordance with each other, it is they that have the bargaining power and not the groups of individuals who provide the most support to these groups. Bringing the powers that be, meaning businesses, politicians, and interest groups, to a more approachable level instills confidence in the individual, encouraging them to become active and work harder in both their personal and work lives. Also to note, wages in communities vary by geographical location within the United States, and therefore these large groups of power may be able to cater to one location and not another. All of the large, powerful entities that try to sway the minds of the masses in the political power and process try to use a one-size-fits-all mentality, as they have one grouping of individuals in charge who cannot specialize in lower forms of government as they are not familiar with the intricacies of the individual communities. Barry Goldwater writes that the enemy of freedom is unrestrained power, and the champions of freedom will fight against the concentration of power wherever they find it. On taxes, reducing taxes in Congress is not likely. The people of the United States view taxes as a fundamental problem within the federal government and not a problem with individual freedoms. Citizens think the government has all the power to take the wealth of the citizens, but the reality is that American taxpayers are not actually obliged to pay higher taxes if the government is accommodating. The government does not have the authority to take all the money individuals earn, and in fact, one of the most important facets of natural rights is an individual's right to own things. A person's earnings are part of a person's property. The government has assaulted property rights through taxation and treated labor as a method for gathering wealth. Having explained that this is an inalienable right, the right to own property, it can also be seen on the reverse that citizens have an obligation to provide a fair amount to the funding of taxes in order to maintain the basic structure of government, as government is in fact essential. Thus, the size of the federal government should be the determinant of how much taxes need to be raised and the rightful amount to be bestowed on the government. And further, the structure of the federal government is laid out in the Constitution so that it should be referred to in rules and regulations regarding the correct sizing of the federal government. If we understand the Constitution, the government's budget should match the funding required to fully delegate the powers enumerated in the Constitution. But when the federal government is providing for programs that are not part of the powers enumerated in the Constitution, it is abusing the authority to tax. The government does have the right to claim an equal and fair share of each individual's earnings, but nothing above necessity. The emphasis here is on equal and fair share and therefore providing no punishment for the successes of individuals. Again, it is the natural right of the right to own and use property that is contrary to the excessive taking of funds by the government. Progressive tax programs are designed to equalize all individuals based on wealth, and many leaders who support such programs aim to redistribute the wealth to poor individuals in the guise of preventing wealth disparity. Their aim is socialism in the form of an attack against the right to own property, work hard, and be rewarded. Individuals in regard to natural rights as understood by many conservatives and religious leaders are that individuals are equal in the sight of God, but by no other means except that they are free. Programs to equalize unequal individuals are a means for attracting votes for unnatural purposes. The major issue lies in the size of the federal budget, which means that spending will not be reduced, and most administrations, although proposing such to get elected, never propose spending decreases in actuality. It should be noted that spending by the federal government should be reduced before the matter of lowering taxes becomes a topic. Reducing taxes before discretionary spending cuts will create spending that the Treasury cannot afford and therefore lead to inflation and economic catastrophe. Increasing federal spending is often argued in order to increase the national defense budget, as can be seen in modern administrations, but conservatives will often argue that a rational approach to defense spending should be encouraged and that offsets can be made by decreasing the budget for other unrelated and unneeded programs in other parts of the government. However, with the population's ever increasing rise, welfare programs will continue to necessitate more and more funding, but this simple increase in population does not merit more funding for welfare programs at the rate that those in power would argue for. Some may even argue that federal spending is justified based on increases in the total production of the United States, but again, the federal budget outpaces the growth in national production. This supposed evil is derived from the government participating in things it has no reason to. Excuse me. Okay, so the government claims that it needs to participate in almost every facet of every social, economic, and military industry, and thus it cannot deny responsibility for providing funding to those industries. To eliminate the programs that are consuming the government spending, the government must forfeit ownership of responsibility for those things. Therefore, the government must taper down programs that are not provided for in the Constitution and allow states to garner the responsibility as well as the local levels of government in order to reduce federal spending. Further, a lot of these programs are better suited to be provided for by private entities and businesses that can do the task without government subsidy. There is no need for government subsidy if they are making a healthy profit and citizens are willing to pay the price for their products and amenities. The need for a middleman, the bureaucratic government, is reduced. Economic prosperity is best brought about not by a large government draining resources, but by reducing the size of government. This is an economic fact. The more money the population possesses, the more they spend or save, and if being saved, it is being invested, all while reducing burdens on the taxpayers and therefore promoting their economic freedom and thus their individual freedom. Socialists have decided that free enterprise has caused a deterioration of social conditions within the United States, but the simple permission for the existence of fundamental protections for workers and foundational principles for those protections allows for higher standards of living and lower wealth inequality due to freedom to work at one's own pace. The point is to incentivize the working class and all individuals, as being argued by conservatives for centuries. Socialists pursue a welfare state which has never been abandoned by them, always moving toward a form of communism and nationalization. They would see more private property taken in order to level the field of individualism to a point where incentives are non-existent, and there would be no ability to become wealthy. Eventually, all of this deteriorates the standards of living for all and prevents the individual from meeting their basic needs. Conservatives despise the welfare state, and as stated, this is because it decidedly incentivizes individuals not to work and produce. They believe that the welfare state and socialism in general are the greatest evil that can be spread throughout this world, and conservatives can even differentiate between socialism through welfare and socialism through nationalism, with the former being more dangerous. The dangers of welfare are not immediately felt and are instituted under the disguise of benefiting those who are suffering, but the dependence on government handouts creates victims out of those who provide the handout, being the taxpayers. The dependence on government handouts creates victims out of those who provide the handout, being the taxpayers. Unfortunately, providing welfare programs preys on the emotions of the voters, and they are prone to support such programs based on emotion rather than logic. This provides temptations for many politicians to argue for these programs simply to garner votes, and because such programs may look good at initial inspection. Thus, being able to select which programs are good based on whether they provide welfare or are appropriate avenues for provisions by the federal government should be of the utmost importance to the voter. Having dependence on welfare has created political and economic power that has been able to manipulate the masses. The emotions of those actors are diluted by support from giving not only the supporters financial resources, but also the resources of their neighbors and others. Those who subject themselves to being dependent on the government are then at the mercy of the government and the politicians in charge, creating a group of voters that are completely swayed by the welfare provided to them and are essentially being bought. They have no responsibility to produce for their own sake and therefore are not providing revenue or anything else to the general good of the nation. Humans at their bare character are disparaged by long terms of unproductiveness and will continue to be wards of the state as long as the humanitarian emotional contriving of the socialists continues. All said, it is not such a machine-like aspect of the government to provide welfare for its citizens, and there are of course reasons for providing charity, but this should be a private issue, meaning at the whim of those who donate regularly. Many individuals, especially those who have religious values, are inclined to give more money, and the less they have to pay in taxes for government-mandated welfare programs, the more they can give to good causes that support the suffering more effectively. This also nullifies the need for mundane and inefficient bureaucratic practices. Also, it is still better to leave welfare up to the state or local government, as the money can be more easily accessed and provided to those who pay the actual funds. Communities benefit from the contributions of their own community. There is hope for the conservative against falling into such a large welfare state, and the socialist can be fended off if humanity can realize the truth of material and spiritual actualizations being connected in a way that promotes the nature of man. That if we hold an individual responsible for their own well-being, they are incentivized to provide for themselves, which benefits those around them, extending even further into taxes and charitable giving. In regard to education, many in the conservative realm, especially wealthier conservatives or those who have no stake in education, such as the childless and retired, would like to see education budgets decrease and an inevitable betterment of privatized options for child rearing. The public school system is riddled with controversy, bad politics, and an overall disdain for the purpose it was created for, according to Barry Goldwater, decreasing the bureaucracy surrounding the learning atmosphere in proportion to enhancing educational experiences is the formula for improving schooling in the nation. He would see emphasis placed on local schooling, private schools, and the care of individual citizens rather than the Department of Education at the federal level. He argues that there are 4 reasons why budgets for education are problematic, even if the main issue is of a quantitative nature rather than qualitative. The first is that there are no terms in the Constitution that denote powers to any authority to regulate education, and it is therefore left to the states. Secondly, bad budget practices by schools lead to overfunding by the federal government, which does not have the means to ensure resources are spent wisely. 3, there is an idea, like many welfare programs, that money from the national government comes at no cost. And 4, the federal government does not mandate educational content conducive to the needs of the nation. Congress should not be allowed to supply money to education and therefore not dictate where and how the money is spent, meaning that this duty is better left to state and local authorities, which understand the needs and wants of the local schooling industry. The issue is not in the creation of such controlling features of the finances, but rather revolves around the ultimate need for the finances, meaning if controls must be set in place to control how finances are spent, then the finances should not be placed in the program in the first place. Conservatives believe the education system has failed the nation and think that something needs to change in the standardized methods of school instituted throughout every public school. The best students should be nourished to their full extent, and problem children rehabilitated and encouraged by alternative means. Individuals need to understand that education is not designed for the people who propose the curriculum and fund the education department, but rather for the students. It is essential that students are given the knowledge and skills needed to succeed and thrive in society, which will inherently make society better in the natural course. The United States needs leaders, and it is important for the educational experience to reflect this. Supporters of education and educational institutions understand that scientific achievement throughout history has not been made by the masses possessing average intelligence, but rather by a few individuals with above average intelligence, cultivating progress. At least this is what Barry Goldwater would argue, and it means that education needs to be catered to the student. Another issue lies in foreign policy, and this is of critical importance to conservative-minded individuals who possess passionate inspiration to support their own nation and are skeptical of the socialist tendencies outside of the United States. Barry Goldwater talks at length about the Cold War, but this can be modified to fit the current era. So this is inspired by Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative. That's where I got a lot of this information. Understanding that keeping the United States a democratic republic and provide a lot of it's my ideas, but a lot of it is also Barry Goldwater's. Understanding that keeping the United States a democratic republic and providing safety from foreign entities is essential. Freedom is valued above all else for the individual and the society as a whole. The nation's identity and whole existence are comprised by foreign agents and the foreign wishes of adversaries to the country. Communism has not been prominent since the turn of the century, but that is not to say that it will not return in force, and there are signs throughout the United States that show wide support and leniency towards socialist tendencies. The socialist and communist ideology and the involved sharing of resources is an idea that is coveted by the masses at first, but quickly turns into despotism when the politicians in charge of these movements control all the power through the means already explained. Communism and socialism provide a darker nationalism than if that nationalism were to revolve around freedom. Strong nations aim to spread their influence around the world, and Western ideals are constantly under attack and threatened by foreign entities that would seek to devolve the world into tyranny and amass power for a few individuals or career politicians who do not understand nor want individual freedoms. Adversaries and enemies that are able to use mass mobilization to thwart attempts at spreading freedom, natural rights, and individual liberties as valued by Western societies are on the verge of direct conflict with the United States, and this has been a recurring theme with larger and more powerful countries around the world in relation to their trying to tear down the superiority of the American people. The ultimate goal of all people is typically peace, which is why conservatives have been left to settle for the spread of socialist tendencies and the expansion of executive powers. The foundation of American foreign policy must be peace through the spreading of freedom, which means that many patriots would die rather than lose the country that puts such a heavy emphasis on freedom and has taught many Americans what it means to appreciate and be grateful for the freedoms that are enjoyed within the United States. Many conservative viewpoints value the alliances that the United States has with like-minded nations and see the importance of fostering mutual protection and cooperation, but there is an ever-growing consensus that only the United States can provide what it means to be free and is the true beacon of freedom. Therefore, the agreements and protections of the people of the other nations, are not as important to the conservatives as many liberals would view them. So even further, the amount of aid provided to foreign and developing nations does not need to be at the level it currently is, and the duty to help poor nations is not as valued by the conservative. All in an attempt to realize the ideals of realpolitik, which stands for promoting self, adapting to the idea that all other entities are doing likewise, others being more concerned with themselves. The American nation is not a charity for other nations, and although the provision of support may help the interests of the United States, allowing other nations to strive for themselves will do them more good than living in a welfare state, as conservatives so vehemently oppose. Of course, this helps strengthen the domestic federal budget and lessens defense spending. Otherwise, these financial resources could also be better spent on American infrastructure and supporting the needs of the domestic citizens. Many foreign nations come to resent that very aid they are given, and resentment builds toward the United States the deeper the foreign involvement becomes. Nor does the Constitution delegate any powers to the American government to dole out tax proceeds to foreign nations. It is a crime to take directly from the American taxpayer and give it to non-citizens living abroad. Who is determining which nations receive foreign aid? It is surely not the American voter. There is another issue with foreign aid in that the United States is giving to other nations that would otherwise still be supporters. They supported the United States in the first place, and there was no alteration to their allegiance. And on an individual level, the politics that dwell in an individual's mind are his own, and although finances can further political goals, it will not sway the core beliefs of the individual. Simply because poor individuals are more prone to communism does not mean this is because they are poor. It is because it is a political philosophy that corrupts the minds of all individuals through political maneuvering. The groups that perpetuate socialist movements, in fact, are typically not poor individuals and are simply putting in efforts to garner their own political support. Thus, it does not make sense to give financial resources to groups or factions, domestic or abroad, that help fight against socialism or any other form of corruption, since it would seem that material wealth is largely irrelevant in the creation, although maybe not the foundations, of communist and terrorist movements. Conservatives would rather have money invested in strong domestic infrastructure and propel the economy forward through free labor and a free market, rather than waste money trying to combat socialism or liberalism. Conservatives should put all their resources into benefiting the individual, whether that be themselves or movements that better individual liberty and relevant educational programs that focus on the individual. Also, conservatives would rather see military support if needed rather than economic welfare assistance to those most staunch of allies, and only when their goals and commitments align with those of the United States. Agreements and deals with adversary nations are not undertaken to better the United States, but rather to commit political warfare against the United States and better themselves. While the United States would see both parties benefit, the nation's foes are only attracted to selfish pursuits. As the United States is the most powerful nation on the planet, it would seem that they are typically on the defensive, maintaining its dominant position, while other nations are on the offensive, trying to take from the United States to level the field, a system of global socialism in itself. There are large differences between the United States and many other nations in terms of ethics, values, norms, and cultures, and the United States places a high value on respecting and maintaining agreements. It should be understood that it is in the best interest of foreign nations to follow suit to achieve the freedoms and individual liberties that emanate and are cherished from and within the United States of America. Conservatives thus play place a high regard for nationalist policies, even stepping to the level of isolationism in a way that shows the United States to be a place of standard for what countries should be like. Socialists and liberals have an idea in their heads that they understand the nation better than conservatives, and in their self-righteousness and belief that their individual betterment is under a welfare state, they believe all individuals would benefit from being under a welfare state. Those perpetuating communist policies think that they can garner support for a movement that promotes laziness and collectivism, and that the general populace would benefit more so under these programs than left to their own devices, showing the lack of faith in God's divine creation of humanity. Okay, so that was Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative. I read that. Oh, I've read all this. The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx is what I base socialism on. For the purpose of this book, we will be using communism and socialism interchangeably. For the most part, and therefore this section on the Communist Manifesto will define what it means to be socialist. The Communist Manifesto was written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and goes into detail about the proletariat and bourgeoisie, but the author has changed them from such to the poor class versus the wealthy class. Karl Marx was a philosopher and socialist of the Romantic era, but he disliked other romantics of his time. He became a radical journalist who did not believe in God and decided that the working class held the key to the future of society. Even though socialism and communism are two different things, the definitions are nuanced to the point where there are more similarities than differences. The idea behind communism is that a dictator comes into control over the nation once the socialist revolution has taken place, and men are driven to do so based on their intrinsic nature. The Communist Manifesto is a direction manual that instills inspiration for government takeover. It is nothing more than a tool to mobilize populations, but it propagates and describes the ideal behind the socialist philosophy. Communism is trendy, and many communist supporters believe that socialism will allow for freedoms from oppression, but usually the opposite occurs. Communism is not in line with the values of the American public and is largely absent from the American political scene. Communists, hear me out. Liberalism is far from communism, even if they seem a step closer than that of more conservative philosophies, and in regard to socialism, the Communist Manifesto can be adapted to modern times, as the author has done so here. The Communist Manifesto was written to further instill fear in the powers of Europe, who were already concerned with communism, and the arguments were furthered by proponents of communism, stating that communism was already understood by Europeans, and they were already accusing opposing forces of being communist. So it seemed a natural pursuit. Humanity is what it says it is. History itself is a history of struggle between the rich and the poor, even between slaves and owners, and between subjects and kings. It can be seen throughout history that there is a large disparity between the rich and poor, always the oppressor and the oppressed. An upper class cannot exist without a lower class, and this disparity always winds up ending in a revolution in some form or another, where society comes back together to reevaluate how it should be structured, usually in another iteration of division by class, upper, lower, and even middle. The modern wealthy elite have come about from generations of this disparity, and generations through inheritance and brutal leadership have maintained control over the masses. The only thing that has changed is the form of oppression used to keep the poor at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Since technology has advanced, so have the means of oppression, but on the flip side, chances for revolt have never been higher. Throughout every industry, the masses have become educated, and people are more intelligent than ever and able to discern for themselves their own social status and where they belong in the hierarchy, in contrast to where they sit. Since manufacturing and production are at an all-time high, societal systems and free markets have allowed for the dissolution of the previous monopolized businesses that ruled over everything. However, in each unique entity of business, people were separated between the working class and upper management, with the rich becoming richer and the poor remaining in their dissatisfactory situations. This has had lasting consequences and has continued to be perpetuated throughout time. New factories, manufacturing, robotics, and automation are creating a world where modern industry is ruled by conglomerates and stockholders that hold all the economic sway over the people in current populations. There is no longer a place for factory workers and manufacturers, or even tradesmen, and rather the middle class is pushed further and further into depravity, thanks to a few wealthy elite. This is the modern bourgeoisie, the upper class oppressing the minimum wage workers and the middle and lower classes, the proletariat. Technology has progressed and developed extremely rapidly and continues to do so at an exponential rate. This has caused the upper class to get wealthier, as stated, at a similar rate, even if the poor's existence slowly deteriorates, always in stark contrast to these elite wealthy individuals. This enrichment of the elite is mirrored by politics. There are not many poor politicians, and politicians are ruled by money and financial sway. The modern political landscape is a disagreement between liberals and conservatives, as seen in the United States, both of which trade in stocks and big money agreements, all of which further turn the wheels of the disconnected mechanism that rules the world. Further and further, the elite take hold of power as they enrich themselves and deem the lower classes further and further inferior. It is a natural course for the upper class to take steps to remain in their dominant position, and they do so by further separating themselves from poverty and those who are pushed to dwell in it. There is no longer a respect for the service industry, and owners of financial resources tear themselves away from needing to involve themselves with anyone who is not part owner or of high repute in upper social circles and businesses. There's no long-lasting bond between persons, and everyone is consumed with their own self-interest and selfish pursuits. The selfishness is materialistic in nature, where the worth of the individual is based on literal financial worth, and no longer do people respect each other for their personal beings. This is all undertaken by the false religious and political movements that hypocritically improve the elite and put the lower classes asunder. Even those who are traditionally deemed to be in the middle class or the previous upper class, such as lawyers, doctors, and engineers, are put to shame by the elite who now rule every facet of society. These occupations are now wage laborers, and many struggle to make ends meet, all due to the corporate greed that belongs to the wealthiest of individuals. Huge mechanisms disguised as free market successes are running rampant, trying to find the appropriate prices to keep the citizens at a destitute level. These companies offer products that they villainously push onto the population at lower prices, then slowly raise the prices to keep profits higher and higher, fueling the company's owners' net worth while disregarding pay for the workers at a rate that matches the inflation of the nation. Technology has advanced so rapidly that the upper class has been the only group able to afford to keep up in an economic sense. Their wealth has grown proportionally to the increase of technology, while the lower class has remained stagnant. And proportionally increased was also the upper class's involvement in politics. In the modern world, the upper class is synonymous with wealthy business people and wealthy politicians, but is there a need for such individuals? Is there a need for the exclusive political sway of individuals based on class? The rich, whenever they become powerful, push the poorer groups further down the hierarchy, and they ruin the natural connection that the mass populace had with life, that being their natural inclination to tinker about in ways that create manufactured goods, works of art, and above all else, service to others. Individual to individual connections have also been torn apart. There is no loyalty to groupings of individuals, or even employee to employer, or voter to representative, because all interactions are based on selfishness and greed. Personal worth is no longer based on the person, but rather their net worth, and people are attracted to those who have it and deem those with low savings and income to be unsuccessful and worthless. Family values have thus been destroyed and no longer revolve around loyalty or tradition, but now revolve around financial safety. Financial success is often what drives families in the modern era, and this is an affront to humanity. The communists and socialists are often concerned with the means of production, meaning the workers' capital investment and resources to produce. All of this changes with the times, and all of it is like a sea for the elite to sail on. Socialists believe that if this ocean of production is taken away, then individuals are essentially equal and better off. Socialists would have individual rights be recognized not through economic rights to material possession and intellectual property, but rather through love and compassion, as an example. Capitalism has spread its greed throughout the world, and a global class system can be observed where, again, the wealthy get richer and the poor remain poor on a global scale. The United States, the capital of capitalism and the home of the wealthiest individuals, would allow the poor to suffer not only at home but everywhere abroad. The rich have exploited the global free market in a way that causes every nation to be based on production and consumption, and the heritage and uniqueness of nations have been destroyed. Nations that were self-sufficient and full of beneficent people who were happy to dwell in lands of sustenance are now ruined by the capitalist machines that would see them work in factories for the chance of owning cell phones and digital products. There is now dependence on the United States and other developed nations by nations that would otherwise have flourished if it were not for the greed of corporations, whether it be the oil industry, diamond industry, textile industry, or computer chip industry. The rich have, through advanced means of manufacturing, been able to turn populations into drones of people to feed drones of workers to feed the hungry. The rich have, through advanced means of manufacturing, been able to turn populations into drones of workers to feed their hunger for goods and money. And further, these nations must adopt the calls and methods of the rich in order to satisfy themselves as competent on the world stage, either adapt or be left behind. So, rural areas have become urbanized, and as can be seen in the United States, this is of temporary value as the city life quickly deteriorates and the masses are forced to live in slums. Local governments and small communities suffer as they are pushed into groupings with other city states and the like, with various cultures being forced together, all in the sake of creating production for the upper classes. The benefits being only small goods that are largely viewed as detrimental to society. We do not see more doctors' offices and lawyer positions, just more and more manufacturing and service labor jobs pushed onto the people. There used to be pride in the trades, and the working class had a reverence and ability to be insightful with means of voicing their opinions, but now they are suffering. Private property and small holdings of land were a source of happiness, but there is no room anymore for the poor to acquire such things, and now they must live in apartments with bare minimum amenities, their happiness being matched by digital assets. Capitalism has betrayed and destroyed the worth of tradesmen. They must unionize or be destitute. There is hope, though, that the rich, the bourgeoisie, the ruling elite, have created such a production and technological bubble that eventually they must fall into their rightful place. Karl Marx would argue that every so often throughout history, the upper class is sent down from their pedestal thanks to a catastrophe, and so humbled as to exist in its bare human state. This can be furthered in that the rich must be educated to the fact that all humans are equal and every individual deserves the bare minimum, if not more, being gifted a decent life. Socialists believe that the viewpoint of conservatives and liberals is that the working class is only as good as it provides wealth and utility to society. They think that the general public views the lower classes as lesser, and the materialist world decidedly does not benefit as much from the minimum wage employee. This has caused the working class to resent the upper elites, a problem the elites have brought about themselves and the reason for their periodic demise. Whilst the bourgeoisie or elites developed their mass production of capital, the working classes brought and expanded with it to make a large foundation for the upper class to rest on. Labor is viewed as a resource or commodity that can be used, bought, and sold. Another problem arises. Not only are the proletariat, the poorest of the classes, as well as the middle class, paid low wages, but they are also attacked as soon as they receive those wages. They are instantly pounced upon to pay up more by mortgage companies, banks, the government, and so much more, to the point where saving money is not possible. In summary, the more manufacturing expands, the more the working class has to work, the more money they are paid, the more the ruling class takes. This all keeps the masses in a state of perpetual stagnation, their standard of living being set at a static level. Socialists call for manufacturers and laborers who were once divided by the competition of their employers to unite in an effort to bring about change and a new prosperity for themselves. Typically, it is the elites that organize the working class to fight against the tyranny of previous ages, but it is up to the proletariat, the lower masses, to rise up and create revolution in their own right. Now, in the modern day, with communication and video sharing galore, workers are able to express their dissatisfaction quickly and globally. It is the social responsibility of the socialists to show their dismay and the indecency of low-wage jobs. At this point, trade unions become involved as they are already a means of organization, and they are able to collectively move towards socialist policies, endorsing candidates whose values align with the working class. This can go further to where the masses of manufacturers revolt and begin the revolution so prominently discussed in the Communist Manifesto. The author, however, is not a communist and does not believe that starting a communist revolution is in any way in the best interest of the American people, especially when considering where the United States has historically stood as the forefront in the fight against communist governments. But it can be stated that socialism serves its purpose and helps to enforce protections for workers and shrink the disparity between the rich and poor. It can be stated that some welfare programs are needed, and this helps to both stimulate the economy and help people on an individual case-by-case basis. Regardless, the next step after forming strong trade union-like entities is to form the Communist Party and the People's Party of Workers and Wage Laborers to unite and begin seizing power. This does not have to be through violent means, as the Communist Manifesto would insinuate as a historical necessity, but the socialist parties around the world are united in their cause to bring wealth equality to the world through the encompassing power of political means. This pits elites against other elites, all vying to consume the powers being created by the upper establishment of the socialist parties, and even more, many fall into the despair experienced by the lower classes. But it is up to the individual not to despair over temporary materialistic burdens, and rather encourage themselves through the movement of the people's parties. Then there are, of course, the masses of upper middle class who are thus divided between supporting the old conservative tendencies of the upper classes and the welfare of the lower poorer classes. These, as Karl Marx explained, likely try to defend themselves and their financial strength through siding with the bourgeoisie. The idea here is the revelation that all individuals will likely pursue to maintain, if not grow, their existing property and financial worth, but many in the lower class lack such possessions. This is not necessarily fair, especially when the upper class exists in such a state largely due to inheritance over time. Wealth disparity is, of course, the primary concern of the modern socialist. A better way of living comes about through not needing material possessions, and although the socialist is concerned with such at first, it is the lack of concern with financial resources that allows the individual to flourish. Allowing for less hard labor and less time-consuming jobs allows the individual to spend time with their families, pursue virtuous endeavors, and promotes the fine and liberal arts. And the greatest kicker of all of this is that likely the middle and lower classes are the vast majority, and in a democratic government, this ought to be the ruling class. Communists, though, are the most radical of socialist movements. They differ from socialists in their anticipation of a revolution that they view as historically necessary. But as has been seen with time, it does not necessarily hold true, except in isolated scenarios. Socialists do not deny the right to personal property, but would seek to put limits on it. Capitalism is the enemy of the socialist, and capitalism is a social policy where capital defines social status. Having more money gives prestige to the capitalist, and taking that away allows for more factual and accurate view of the individual. If capital is transferred from the private domain to that of the public, the social hierarchy and method of class definition change. This means that the culture of the nation will change from being one of selfish prosperity by the oppression of the masses to a more beautiful utopia. Socialists view wages for labor to be minimized due to the profit-seeking greed of the upper class and would see all people having a living wage that allows equal prosperity throughout the nation. Communists would do away with all personal property, while socialists would rather just level the playing field for fair opportunity for all. Socialists would allow for equal private property and an equal opportunity to gather more. Communists would get rid of it and allow the government to give and take at its discretion. These are stark differences with similarities. There's a hostile argument that reverberates throughout those who are opposed to socialism, that is the so-called welfare state will induce laziness and lower production throughout the masses. But if this were true, communists and socialists argued, then the rich would have indulged in laziness long ago, having all their needs met. It is the natural instinct of the human condition, as previously stated by the author, to tinker and want to produce and explore more and more. Many conservatives would argue that it is great men of stature who create the turning of the wheels of history in a positive direction, as the lower populations are not credited with great achievements. But this is a farce in that the culture is derived from the wealthy in like ways that they oppress the financial worth of the poor. They oppress the culture of the poor. The worst argument proposed by conservatives is that a welfare state depreciates family values, but socialists would view this as a preposterous proposal based on the idea that conservatives put family worth based on financial production and net values. Socialists, on the other hand, would assume traditional family values as key, not the net worth of the family and the production of each member. Social norms are more easily adopted by the socialists as well, and they would have these social lessons incorporated into the educational system, where conservatives would, in the view of the socialists, prefer to have history and knowledge written by the minority ruling class. I read that wrong. Conservatives would have... It doesn't matter. Okay, religious and philosophical pursuits by socialists revolve strongly around learning from history, not the history of learning, meaning that the lessons of what has been learned throughout history are more important than elitist means of educating the masses. This justifies the teaching of communist principles in communist nations, but also encourages the teaching of history through the lens of the oppressed class, pointedly such as slaves and other working class individuals. This gives a better reflection of the true history of the world, and it is the bravery and stories of the masses of the common people that give truth to the movement of societal justice. Next, we have liberalism. Moving on. Liberalism, a very short introduction by Michael Frieden, is where I got inspiration for this part. And this is the second great part of my book. The first great part I already read. The third great part is about the Constitution. The second great part, this part is about books and inspiration from books. The first great part was from my head. Okay, so liberalism is a very prominent political philosophy originating from Europe some 200 years before the turn of the millennium, and is a structured method for maintaining society in a way that supports the political wants of the masses. It is primarily focused on the individual, similar to conservatism, and seeks to protect the right for individual discovery and promote openness to possibilities that would benefit the individual and the whole of society. Many have varying definitions of liberalism, and there is no strict adherence to the philosophy. Different forms have taken shape and changed, going in and out of view over time. In classical fashion, liberalism has delved deep into individual liberty, individual rights, and the importance of upholding the rule of law and preventing the overstepping of governments, which have a tendency to devolve into dictatorships. More socialist forms of liberalism put a higher emphasis on collectivism and the mutual helping of others as a way to benefit all those around them. From this rose what has previously been described as a so-called welfare state, and in contradiction has caused the proliferation of neoliberalism, which would forego most social security type programs for an emphasis on the free market and competition between businesses. It is interesting to note the lack of commonality between those who support collectivism and those who support the independent pursuit of making as much money as possible. Liberalism, then, is both about increasing individual rights and providing respect for all those in society, providing them with basic needs to survive, at least. It is about allowing the individual to be their best, but also preventing hurt to those around them, and it promotes productivity and balance with that of human existence. Some argue that liberalism is a mask for shadowy intentions and wishy-washy philosophy meant to appease everyone, but in a way, everyone who practices liberalism has their own definition and points on the scales of each category of opinion, and therefore it can be viewed that there are many forms of liberalism all falling under a grand scope. The success of liberalism, as it is largely the most dominant political philosophy in the modern day, is due largely to the indefiniteness of the ideology and its method to view present events and ideas with rational and logical thinking and differentiate between the clashing opinions of society. Although liberalism is the widely held political belief of most of the world, it is not necessarily recognized by a majority of the globe, and the term and labeling of things as liberal has caused a misguided perception of individuals who are not necessarily as progressive as they would seem, but are observed as such thanks to misinformation and malicious propaganda. Many liberals place a large emphasis on the constructs of democracy by placing the power in the hands of the people, this being the best path toward what is good and correct. Elections are won in the name of social justice. However, this does not define the purpose of liberalism in the regard that it is a worthy system of government, because democracy is lacking in some facets in its own right as the best form of government. Democracy must promote equality, individual rights, justice, liberty, happiness, and all the other adjectives normally prescribed to a good society, and liberalism works in the background to promote the well-being of all voters in the democracy with or without government support. Meaning, just because a democracy is run by liberals and considered a liberal institution does not mean that liberalism is flourishing. There are liberal mindsets and ways of thinking that allow for values and norms to be in line with the best sense of morality and justice, and these are instituted by society at large, not the politicians selected to lead, although having both is preferred. As stated, there is not one true definition of liberalism. Even many socialists have argued that liberals exploit the working class and promote selfishness, contradictory to the overreaching of collective bargaining that conservatives accuse liberals of. Liberalism, as being the dominant political philosophy around the globe, receives a lot of criticism, and liberals often are targeted for supporting larger government interference in sociological pursuits of civil rights and even promoting overgiving of welfare and support for the disenfranchised, especially by conservatives. People tend to believe that focusing on the collective somehow takes away from individuality, but it is the existence of a social contract that allows the individual to flourish. Providing support for the disenfranchised allows them to better themselves, and by bettering themselves, they are bettering those around them and are able to give back a continuous loop. All in the name of fostering a better community and more freedom for all. Freedom from oppression allows freedom for the individual. Some other criticism revolves around its support for Western ideals, neglecting traditionally held beliefs of conservatism and religion, promoting rationality over emotional values, and being called things such as an optimistic view of a bleak reality. However, there are many supporters of liberal ideals who describe it as an idea that disposes of conflicting ideologies, promotes humanity to the fullest, and seeks to find truths in a complex world. It promotes equality and human flourishing while providing essential rights prescribed by God, mindful of the rights also deserved by others. The modern state is one of a liberal mindset. Even if politicians consider themselves staunch conservatives or socialists, they are often liberal to the degree to which the most extreme of past generations have been. Liberals place the good of the individual on a pedestal above any of the misvalued leaders who have been corrupted by power, and understand there are limits to the government's ability to rule, but also that it is essential and generally beneficial. They understand that a free market is the best pursuit for allowing the rights to own property to benefit the individual and prevent the inhibition of individual freedoms, such as those in a communist state. They respect laws and the legal system, although they often argue for being more lenient in some cases, but this is based on a high propensity for supporting human dignity. Emphasis is also placed on the uniqueness of the individual as a support for creativity and artistic mindsets, and there is high regard for equality among various ethnicities and cultures present throughout the world. Many leaders of thought regard liberal ideals as in pursuit of justice and righteousness, balancing the justice for the individual with justice for all and calling it righteousness. They believe the government should be devoid of interfering in the moral propensities of the people and that interference to dismantle protections for targeted groups is of the utmost evil. One should not push down one view of liberalism for another, and the whole of the ideology should be respected as good, placing a midpoint on the liberal spectrum as a mark to evaluate the extremities of the ideals of those who are adherents. A rational view of liberalism is best when viewed throughout history. Understanding the development of human enlightenment and rational thought is the best way to measure the philosophy. Scholars studying liberalism have described the ideology as having a layer-like structure that has developed over time. 5 marked ideals that persist throughout the majority of liberals to this day: a propensity for the rule of law being the first. The second is an emphasis on the free market. The third, placing the individual above all without infringing on the rights of others. Support for the welfare of others as a fourth. And fifthly, recognition and respect for all diversities of people.